Right. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you to this installment of Table Talk, a series of conversations with academics and writers who write on animals and human-animal relations. We are the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan Harris, and my co-host Anu Pandey is also here. We try to bring together academics and writers and thinkers who are working on animals in India and South Asia. Today we have with us Dinesh Wadiwel, and we are going to discuss his book, Animals and Capital. The talk is going to be recorded and it's going to be available on our website and our YouTube channel. And it's a very informal discussion, so feel free to ask a question at any point or raise your hand or post a comment in the chat box. I thought we could begin the discussion to address some of the disclaimers you make in the book. So I thought I'd ask you about the title, Animals and Capital, and why is it not animals and capitalism, or why is it not animals and human exceptionalism, which are some of the common ways we've been thinking about factory farming or exploitative human-animal relations in general. I thought that we could begin there.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks for the question, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It's really lovely to be talking about the book. And it's a great question. I'm going to try and do justice. The title, partly I should just say firstly, the title is actually a direct reference to a book by the Italian Marxist Mario Tronti. So Mario Tronti has a book called Workers and Capital. And in that book, he tries to describe the confrontation between the working class and capitalism. When I started doing research for this book, something that really struck me was that capitalism for animals is a system of domination. The way that capitalism materializes for animals is effectively about a system of violence and coercion that aims at complete domination. And in that respect, I thought this title actually works, Animals and Capital, because it actually references this element of the Italian Marxist reading of capitalism, which was not so much just an economic system, but a system of power and unequal relations or domination. The other reason that I've picked the title is that, firstly, as I've just mentioned, the book is partly an interrogation of Karl Marx and his philosophy. So it's partly referencing Marx's most famous text, Capital. But it's also trying to take seriously the relationship between capitalism and, as you might have described it, human exceptionalism, or how others might describe it as speciesism, or how I describe it in the book as hierarchical anthropocentrism. I use that phrase, hierarchical anthropocentrism, to describe what I would say is a particular European Enlightenment model of anthropocentrism that I think prevails today. And this is the idea that humans are the superior species. We're at the top of the tree, and that all other creation sits below in a kind of hierarchy. And this is we see some of these maps of this hierarchy in late 1800s and 1900s, early 1900s schematizations. As many scholars have pointed out, this hierarchy also tied closely with colonialism and forms of racism, which also ranked different humans in this hierarchy. So I would argue that we're dealing with this problem of a kind of hierarchical anthropocentrism. And I also want to frame that, in describing that, I want to make clear that different societies have different forms of anthropocentrism, but this is the prevailing form of anthropocentrism that we face today. So I don't want to flatten all anthropocentrism, but I want to say that this is something that's prevailing today. In my view, to understand something like the factory farm, we can't just talk about hierarchical anthropocentrism. We need to talk about actually the exchange between hierarchical anthropocentrism and capitalism. It's actually these two forces that come together. In the book, and something maybe we can get to, I talk about the factory farm as this space where fixed capital, so machines, technologies, enclosures dominate. In fact, actually, if we look at the factory farm and particularly the trajectory of the factory farm, we see that human labour starts to reduce. So humans become less and less part of the active engagement with animals. And it is fixed capital, enclosures, technologies, machines that actually dominates. And that's why we call it a factory farm. That's the factory in the factory farm. So the other reason for the title of the book is that I want to highlight this confrontation between animals and what I'll describe as fixed capital. And fixed capital meaning, in a kind of Marxist sense, the form of capital that capital takes in the form of machines, enclosures, technologies in that production process.
And I also wanted to ask a question that's probably on some people's minds here, which is that, when you're talking about animals and capital, you're also talking about it as part of a capitalist system that's functioning worldwide. And there are forms of it actively working in different ways. So, and then you also make a distinction between a kind of antagonistic politics and a kind of ontological flattening that happens, which I found very interesting. So how would you, if we were to speak plainly, how would it apply to a country like India, which one wouldn't call as highly capitalist as countries in the global north, but factory farming and industrial production of animal agriculture is becoming more common. So then, how do we capture the asymmetries of the exploitation and not make that another kind of ontological flattening?
Sure, yeah, and I think so. The book describes this process of intensification that we've seen globally as a trajectory. So I'd make it very clear. And one thing I'd want to say up front is that one problem with lots of animal rights literature, I'd say, is that it's very informed by particularly the North American experience, by the form of vertical integration and intensification that's happened in the US particularly. And this misses that in different contexts, we see different arrangements of production that are still capitalist, but they don't necessarily have the same, particularly involvement of fixed capital technologies, machines, and clothes. I think India and to an extent China actually are really good examples of economies where we're seeing transition, but also as a result, models of production that don't look like models of production, say in the US or Australia, where I come from. It's notable that China and India are the world's largest producers of meat and dairy, like together. So, I mean, to me, that's also one problem with lots of animal rights literature. It's just failed to acknowledge this. So China is the world's largest producer of selling pork. India, as far as I'm aware, is the world's largest producer of dairy. So to me, actually, we need to pay attention to those conditions. What I can say is that every production system has a conglomeration of labour, technologies, and raw materials. What we see in somewhere like India is there's a high involvement of both human labour and what I would describe as animal labour, and usually a lesser involvement of forms of fixed capital in that. And sometimes, I mean, to give you one example, in industrial forms of animal agriculture where you have a factory farm, typically feed is brought in, so there's industrial production of feed that is fed into the factory farm. But this is quite different from forms of production where animals, for example, like backyard production, where animals are effectively grazing in the backyard, right? So this is quite different, or in the village or in the rubbish tip, as happens in some places in the world, right? So this is quite different arrangement of production. And this dominates in different parts of the world. One thing I'd say about certainly China India to a lesser extent, but this is still coming true in India, is that the trajectory of intensification is still happening. So we're seeing the arrival as capitalist production rationalities shape production, as the demand to reduce the cost of human labour time impacts those forms of production. We see machines, technologies, enclosures increasingly part of that process. We see the arrival of more and more animal bodies and the production of more and more animal products at the end of that. In the case of China, what we've seen is China has the world's largest backyard pig industry, but China is radically reshaping that production at the moment and producing some of the largest factory farms in the world. We're also seeing forms of intensification happen in India. One thing I'd also say is that model of vertical integration that we see in the US, where one firm owns everything and sometimes co-locates production in one place, isn't necessarily the model that we see, as far as I'm aware, in China and India. So sometimes you might see more, what I'd say, disintegrated forms of production where different sites of production are brought together. To give you one example that I talk about in the book, in China, there are companies that mass produce chicks, like chicken chicks, and they're distributed to families who raise them in their backyard and then return to the factory farm to be slaughtered. And this is effectively a disintegrated model of production where a whole phase of production is moved outside of the kind of the formal company, and a local form of production is substituted. So to me, actually, this is stuff we need to pay attention to, because it looks very different from the US model. But importantly, it draws from the different production efficiencies, as you'd like, in different parts of the world, which includes the fact that human labour power might be available in different ways in different parts of the world to be part of that production process.
Anu, go ahead.
Thanks, Susan. Thank you for that question, for bringing up the asymmetries, because that was something that I was thinking about also from a slightly different angle. Dinesh, thank you for your elaborate answer to that, which helped me sort of formalize what I wanted to talk about. And that was also about how, when we speak about the processing of animals for food, one usually comes across the argument that the figures cited showing that it is reaching or has reached catastrophic proportions all emanate from the global north, and therefore India does not have a similar scale of problem. And that kind of made me feel, given the fact, and you just mentioned as well, India and China are among the world's leading producers of animal-based foods. Consumption is obviously not the correct yardstick, if one were to think about what's going on and the amount of, what's happening at the grassroots level. What do you think would be a more suitable yardstick, if not consumption? Would it be what you call the processing of animals, or would you suggest something else instead, something that brings out the true picture? And then I had a question as well, if I may ask that right away. You mentioned in your book about how food animals constitute a distinct economic class within capitalism. And I was interested in knowing how you mean that.
Sure, thank you. So let's start with the first question, which I think is a great one. So I think there are two parts of the question I think are important. One is that actually the consumption figures, the way they are constructed, often miss the full picture. One way they miss the picture is that when we look at, say, per capita meat consumption, so India has some of the lowest per capita meat consumption in the world. This ignores actually dairy. So India actually has some of the highest per capita dairy consumption, right? So we don't take that picture into account. Now, of course, I'm South Indian background. I understand the context, which is that India culturally has a large number of vegetarians, but these are vegetarians who also consume a lot of dairy potentially. The other thing that's missing in that construction of meat is seafood. When you include seafood into the picture, then India doesn't have a low per capita meat consumption. Actually, it looks more like a middle range country. And to me, that's something interesting about the way we choose to construct that problem. And I don't mean to minimize the fact that actually I still think India is a remarkable country because of that culture of vegetarianism, which, as you know, is politically interesting and problematic in India. But it does help to understand what is complex and contradictory about India as a country in terms of looking at those statistics. Leaving aside that measurement issue of consumption, I do think it is production that we need to also pay attention to. And we need to understand both sides, and that's often misunderstood. One way to measure production is number of animals slaughtered, which gives you some indication of production. Although typically the figures that are available at say from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization exclude fish from that calculation. So we don't have any way to understand how many fish are used per country. And we don't have any way to understand reliably how many fish are slaughtered, although we know that the numbers are potentially huge, potentially in the trillions. Another way to measure production, of course, is around, if we think about dairy, it's the standing stock of animals that are used within production. And that also gives us some estimate. But these are the things that we would have to be paying attention to as well, because countries like China and India are actively positioning themselves as exporters of meat and dairy. And certainly, as we know, China paradoxically is an exporter of beef and a significant exporter of beef in the region. And again, this is the stuff that we need to pay attention to if we want to get a complete picture of how meat and dairy production happen and how it interacts with consumption, local consumption, which is sometimes not in a direct way. So that makes sense. The second question about animals as a class. In the book, I make the claim, and we can maybe talk about this in more detail. I make the claim that animals are laborers. Here I make the argument that animals enter production as a raw material, but they are required to labor upon themselves to produce a product. I make this argument based on my reading of particularly feminist labor theory and the way that bodily metabolic processes can be captured in production processes to become value producing. And there's lots of feminist labor theory that particularly looks actually at commercial surrogacy in India and makes the claim that if we look at these processes, the body itself can become the means of production. So in my book, I make the claim that actually we can think about animals as laborers as well. And this actually helps to explain why they have been so useful to capitalism, because they're not only a means of subsistence for human populations, but they're also value producing beings. The reason I make the claim that animals constitute a specific class or a separate class is because that positioning as raw material, as labor, and as the product is quite different from the human laborer. The human laborer in the classic Marxist text only sells their labor power. That's it, right? So their labor power is bought and not themselves, not their bodies. But animals, as we know, they enter production as a raw material, and they're simultaneously a hybrid of that raw material and labor, and they will become, unfortunately dead, the product. To me, this means that they have a completely different structural condition. One thing I'd note in making this claim is that as a labour force, like let's treat them as a labour force, as a separate labour force, they are far more numerous than humans in production. So at this point, probably the standing stock at any one time of land animals in global animal agriculture is probably about 50 to 60 billion animals, and probably 300 or 400 billion fish, right, in industrial agriculture. So this gives us a sense of the size of this labour force. The argument of the book is that this class or this structural class has been constructed by capitalism. That doesn't mean that animals weren't used before for food. It means that their positioning as a source of surplus in this way by capitalist animal agriculture is novel and produces them as a distinct class that has been, if you like, bred by capitalists. Hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I thought we could talk a bit more about, the asymmetries and, for example, if we're thinking about when we talk about animals and capital and the capitalist system, there seems to be and metaphors that occur in our minds where the human is exploiting the animal within a system from which the animal can't free herself in any way. I think there are two ways to think about it. All humans are equally participating in that exploitation and oppression, or the humans themselves are also victims, such as in a slaughterhouse. So then when we're thinking about capitalism, are you trying to focus on animals themselves in this frame, or do you acknowledge that that humans may have vulnerabilities and dependencies as well, or are all humans equally participating in this oppression?
That's a great question. And I think partly the book tries to offer a frame that in some ways gets us out of this particular form of thinking. And I'd say it's a form of thinking that we inherited from the analytic philosophy roots of contemporary animal rights theory, right? So lots of contemporary animal rights theory, let's say we think about this as from the 70s and 80s. And I don't want to say that's all animal rights theory. Obviously, people have been thinking about animals in critical ways for millennia, right? And I think India is actually an important place where this has happened, right? But if we think about contemporary animal rights theory from the 1970s and 80s on, and particularly animal rights theory born in the US Academy, it was largely based on moral theory and questions around complicity of individuals in ethical wrongs. So some of those books, like Peter Singer's Animal Liberation or Tom Regan's Case for Animal Rights, made an argument that how we use animals was wrong. And then the first step to dealing with this was making ethical choices as individuals. And this created particular debates around which humans are complicit, how can you get out of the complicity with the system? I'm not saying these are wrong, right? So I'm a long-term vegan. I think it's important to make ethical choices. However, what it misses is the possibility of a structural analysis. And this is a structural analysis which tries to understand relations of power in society and the way that these relations of power position different beings, whether they're humans or non-humans. In the case of capitalism, the point I try to make in the book is that capitalism is a system of domination. It's a system of domination that, in my view, produces a systematic failure of justice for most of the planet. Most of the world are born into conditions that they do not choose and produce radical inequality in terms of their life opportunities and produce conditions of actual death for many humans, but also billions of animals, in order for this system to extract its profitability. In my view, this also positions humans in relation to other humans in forms of inequality, and also positions animals in relation to human populations. One of the important ways that animals are positioned in relation to human populations has been the positioning of animals as a means of subsistence for human populations. So this is one of the complications we face, is that over the last 100 years, we've seen a rising per capita consumption of animal-based foods. This has been actually structurally driven by the overproduction strategy of capitalism. So capitalism as an economic system tends to overproduce commodities as a pathway to gaining profits. It produces these commodities with no particular reference to the need of human populations. which means that either those commodities are poorly targeted, and of course we live in a world where despite all the wealth and the overproduction of food, millions and millions of people are starving every day, or actually billions. And it also produces these commodities with no direction in terms of what do individuals actually need for their survival. So we live in the midst of that mess, and one of the aspects of this has been a rising per capita production of animal-based foods, and with this, the cheapening of animal-based foods and animal life, and the change in human diets, which has happened globally. So almost everywhere, the foods that have appeared on people's plates have become more and more meat-based. And this has actually fundamentally changed whole cultures. And as you know, this is changing the culture of India as well, right, as we speak. So this is one dimension of this structural problem. And it is actually one way to look at this is that it has placed animal populations in a situation of antagonism in relation to human populations. And this is because for many human populations globally, the freedom to choose what you eat, but also the perception that you cannot survive without animal products has actually meant that animals live to die for human populations in a way that's more fundamental than at any time in human history. So this is one of the structural contradictions we have before us. The second thing, of course, is that animals have been overproduced as a means of surplus, as a means of profit. But this profit isn't shared equally, right? We live in societies that are fundamentally equal, unequal, right? The nature of capitalism, the only way that capitalism works is that most people do not own capital. Most people enter this economic system as workers and have to work to survive, while a small group of people, and as we know, there's lots of now economic and sociological theory which says this small group of people who own most of everything is shrinking. This small group of people enjoy those profits. Right? So again, this produces a different contradiction, right, before us, that those who benefit from this massive explosion in animal agriculture we've seen in the last century do not share the benefits equally with human populations. Now, the reason I want to share this structural story is that it helps to explain at least some of the stuff that we see before us. Of course, individuals can make choices, but we're all part of this larger global structural story. And it's a structural story that both places at us and our survival at odds with those of animals, but also it's a structural story that positions the benefits of this whole system in unequal ways, right? And that's not only in a global sense, but between countries too, right? I mean, because we live in a world where actually the livelihoods and the living standards of different people depend on their locality, and some of the reasons for that are purely historical and completely unfair. Now, does this explain everything? No, of course not, right? So of course there are structures of gender and race and colonialism that have also overlapped this story. So I don't want to make the claim that this explains everything, but it certainly explains a lot of the structural reality for us. And to me, this is more useful or more persuasive than this idea that we all need to make individual choices and then remove ourselves from complicity with animal exploitation. I don't think that quite works, right? Again, I don't want to downplay ethical decisions, but we need a bigger story to describe what has been going on with our relations with animals.
That's a really helpful response. I'll wait for Rukmini to ask her question. We can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself? Oh man, I bet she has something interesting to ask you about your insightful response.
We're waiting for.
Yeah. Okay, I guess please go ahead and ask your question when you unmute yourself. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask you about capitalism and its connection to reality, because when you discuss animal rights and animal welfare, you talk about how the animal welfare people want to be realistic and therefore ask for welfarist approaches in our relations with humans. And so just in and this is something that we hear a lot in academic discussions around non-human animals in India as well, that one needs to be realistic or take into account other humans' realities as well. So then, in such a schema, would capitalism be also an explanation of a common reality? Is that how you would position capitalism, or is it a way of framing non-human animals as political agents and also laborers?
So that's a great question. So in the book, I make the claim that animal welfarists, and they frequently claim this, claim to be, as you noted, right, claim to be realistic, and the animal rights people are idealists, right? To an extent, I think this is actually true. And one of the reasons is that welfarists, when they say they're being realistic, they're talking about the market. They're literally talking about how are animals positioned by capitalism, and how do we minimally respond to that positioning to try and say relieve them from unnecessary suffering. But one thing I note in the book is that in making these realistic claims, welfarists are not at all interested in challenging either hierarchical anthropocentrism as a kind of force, or capitalism, right? So often the proposals are designed to either work in conformity with capitalism, or as the book highlights, there are a number of cases where welfarists actually help capitalism through welfarist reforms. So one example I give in the book is the implementation of curved corrals in slaughterhouses. So slaughterhouses often have, in many parts of the world, have a straight chute that leads to slaughter. And of course, because animals can see and smell what is going to come, many animals will hesitate or balk before they enter, and this slows production. A number of welfarists, including notably Temple Grandin, proposed designs for curved slaughterhouses, which we start to see appearing globally. Curved corrals, sorry. And these corrals basically, because they curve into the site of slaughter, they block the vision of what is to come, and animals move more speedily through to their deaths. The claim by welfarists is that this reduces suffering, and that's visibly true, but it also speeds production. And to me, actually, this is the way that welfarism works in a realistic way to actually help capitalism. The point of the book isn't to say we should abandon idealism. It's actually to resituate this problem. We need to actually be, as advocates, we need to be aware of the actual processes that are driving the problems we see before us. So if capitalism is seeking to speed up production, knowing this tells us that as advocates, we need to slow down and eliminate, right? We need to slow down and stop, right? So to me, it gives us some structural ways to actually deal with the problems we are facing. So I'm not necessarily saying that I reject idealism. Actually, the book is highly idealistic because I want capitalism to end, right? I mean, that's actually, I make this very clear in the book, right? However, I'm utterly realistic about the economic processes we face, right? And I want our strategies to not strategies that help to speed up or aid and abet capitalism in its processes, that actually understand that we're dealing with a combination of both hierarchical anthropocentrism and capitalism. And our strategies need to deal with that reality. They need to actually target the kinds of political actions that are going to stop or slow down these processes that we've seen that explain the acceleration in the use of animals for food and other purposes. Hope that answers your question, Susan.
Hi, Susan, are you still there?
Looks like the connection's not good.
Yeah, I think she's probably, the screen's frozen or something. In the meantime, I'll pop in with a question of my own until she kind of comes back. This is this thing where you also mentioned how animal advocates, people working for animal rights, for example, and anti-capitalists, they share a terrain, they're actually both working on the same terrain. It overlaps. Yet one finds often that what happens to animals is sort of excluded from all the conversations, or most of the conversations around anti-capitalism on the grounds. And this one encounters in India very well. And I'm open to that argument as well, but I was wondering if you could again suggest a way around it. So one would say on the grounds that concern for animals is not a priority as long as we are living in a society or in a state where marginalization, oppression, and exploitation continue to characterize the human condition, and where stark inequalities exist between, among the human population. Um, I understand where this comes from. At the same time, it seems fundamentally flawed to me. And I would be interested in knowing your thoughts on this. How does one counter this argument to convince people that it's the same cause at the end of the day that one is speaking about?
Thanks, Anu. That's a great question. I think actually we need to be realistic of the limits of the capacity of animal advocates to work with other social movements. And that doesn't mean that I don't think alliances are possible. We actually just need to understand the differences. So some animal rights people will say it's all the same cause. We should all be on the same page. But I actually feel like it's important for us to stop and recognize the tensions and the antagonisms and name them for what they are. As I mentioned, the structural analysis that I put forward in the book actually highlights the terms of this antagonism, right? The fact that animals are positioned as a means of subsistence for human populations actually throws up a huge antagonism. It means that, and we see this, of course, play out, right? On one hand, you have organizations like the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Bank worried about food security, starvation in different parts of the world, including India, putting forward the expansion of animal-based food production as the solution. And we have to find a way to deal with this, right? Because at the end of the day, animals have been positioned as a means of subsistence and even a form of freedom for human populations. And this puts us in antagonism. We also see on the left some different versions of this, right? So lots of the left have said, we need to go back to small-scale animal agriculture and support small-scale animal agriculture producers in the global south, right, as the solution. Right? And again, this is maybe not necessarily helping us get to where we need to go, which is to be asking critical questions about animals. So I think it's important to just recognize that. And part of the book highlights that actually the structural interests of animals as a class maybe in many ways are antagonistic to those of humans. So I would argue that what we need is a kind of alliance politics, right? And it's not an assumption of solidarity. It's recognizing that maybe we have a different set of concerns as animal advocates, but we can work in alliance on certain campaigns. One thing I think that's important just in terms of the general movement is recognizing that capitalism itself is a problem. And I think from different dimensions, we're seeing this, right? So I think globally, a range of radical green groups, environmental groups, have recognized that our economic system is fundamentally incompatible with the planet and its planetary systems. Right? And anthropogenic climate change is about capitalism. It is about this tendency for overproduction. We need to be part of those conversations. Right? And I know lots of advocates are trying, but I think that's one thing that we have to be part of. We've seen globally lots of movements that are essentially about versions of decolonial movements that are interested in questions like land back, like reparations. And to me, actually, these are also important conversations that we should be part of, right? And there's actually stories that relate to animals that are part of that structure. More concretely around animal agriculture, I think there are lots of potentials for shared campaigning, which aren't necessarily about the radical goals that upfront about radical goals that we're setting ourselves to end this form of production, but help us down the path. So, for example, one tendency I mentioned in animal agriculture as it intensifies is increasing line speeds, so increasing production. In most sites where there is intensive forms of industrialization, there's a push to speed up line speed so you can produce more and more animals over time. And invariably, this leads to higher rates of injury for workers. So there's an obvious relationship here for us, right, in terms of alliances with particularly trade union movements to try and slow down line speeds. Again, I don't want to stress, because obviously some of this has come from places like the US where you have this sort of strong model of vertical integration. But there are other models in the global south that are relevant, such as seafood processing, which happens, and there's a lot happening in China, but there's a lot happening in India as well, where usually there's low wage or even forced labor used in those facilities and very high production rates, right? So again, from my perspective, there's every reason for animal advocates to partner with labor unions because we're potentially interested in this same problem about slowing down production. I think also relevant to forced labor, there's also lots of scope around the campaigning that's happening particularly in the Asia Pacific around the use of forced labor within wild fish capture. Around half of the seafood that is used globally comes from wild fish capture, and a lot of it happens in the Asia Pacific region. There are endemic problems with forced labor in those industries, either on the ship or in processing. And there are trade unions and environmentalists now working in alliance to try and stop this sort of production. In my view, actually, again, there's every reason for animal advocates to be aware of and involved in these campaigns. It's not that the people involved want to stop fishing, full stop, but there's every reason for us to be involved in those campaigns to actually try and stop this industry. So again, that's an example of the kind of alliance politics we could be talking about, but regularly isn't talked about by animal advocates, that again tries to take this structural picture into account that I've tried to describe in the book.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Before we take Daniel's question, I just wanted to ask a clarification. And also because it's the last 15 minutes, I think we're going to get a lot of questions, which is that in addition to Daniel's comment, I was just thinking about the section in the book where you talk
Hi, Susan, you're not audible. We couldn't figure out what you were saying. Could you try again, or otherwise type the question? I think there's a problem with your connection.
No,
No.
it's not good. You might have to type it. Why don't you type the question, Susan, and I'll respond to it.
Yeah. Do you want to take Daniel's question in the meantime?
Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Dinesh. A pleasure to hear your voice and your thoughts. Thank you very much. And partly you answered my question, but I think I'd like to still elaborate when you mentioned campaigns and how I was really wondering. Basically, it's two questions I have. I was wondering how to bring your work closer to a larger audience, and also who this discussion could be reached with, or how to get people involved of discussions on such level, I would say, because I think your work is really profound and very elaborate and insightful as you reveal a larger structure, but also because of this very complexity and insightfulness of your work, I feel that maybe it might be more difficult to get it out there, let's say. And I mean, you mentioned that you think, for example, it would be a nice opportunity to join forces with union workers, let's say. But I was wondering of what you think of how to reach these people, and or like how to reach a larger audience. I wanted to ask how you see your work as a scholar there, and also maybe if you have any insights on the role of arts in this field, maybe. Asking this because of being an artist myself. And also another question I wanted to ask briefly is maybe if you see some agency for animals in this system, and also for us to give hope or just to, because of course we are all subject to this system, including animals. But I was wondering where one could still see some sort of agency and or space for revolt in this system.
Great questions, Daniel. I'll try and answer them quickly because I'm aware that time is running out. And I think there's some more questions in the chat. But really good questions. So firstly, just on the question of agency, the book has a strong line around the resistance of animals actually being fundamental to understanding the problem. To maybe give you one example of this, if we look at fishery practice, fishing, including industrial fishing, involves tracking down, luring, and capturing beings who don't want to be caught. And in fact, from a kind of Marxist value perspective, value arises from countering the resistance of fish. So something I make very clear in the book is that actually the agency of animals is fundamental to this problem. Part of the reason why, one other reason why the book takes the framing it does, and why, again, coming back to the title, it takes that framing of animals against capital, is that we are witnessing a confrontation. It is actually about animal vitality, their resistance against capitalism, which tries to subdue that resistance in the name of value creation. So that's one view. So again, that's one way to conceptualize the book. Just in relation to how we should act, I should say right up front, I'm a political theorist, I'm a political philosopher. The book is designed to interrogate in a kind of academic, theoretical way a set of problems, but it's designed for others to learn from and to take those lessons out into the field. So I'm not I'm a professor. I have some background involved in social movements, but I don't have all the answers. And sometimes I think it's how you take these ideas and apply them in the field that are going to be the important thing. And that goes beyond the scholar, right? But one thing I'd say is that I have this view of social change where I think part of and it's a particularly, it's an idea that I would say comes from someone like Antonio Gramsci. It's an idea that we all have a job to, as intellectuals, and I mean all of us, to theorize the problem before us. And through that theorization, to together come up with the strategies we need to deal with it. That doesn't mean that I have the answers, because I don't, right? So I've got ideas that come from the book, and I've talked about sort of unionization and things like that. But I actually think this is the stuff that needs to happen collectively. We need to think through how we conceptualize the problem and collectively think through, as a result, what are the strategies and tactics we need to solve the problem. I'd say that one thing just finally about art, I think it's a really important area, right? Because art captures what cannot be expressed in words, right? Sometimes that's what it does perfectly. And it brings together complex ideas in ways that words can never do justice to. So maybe as an artist, you might be able to capture elements of this problem, this sophisticated problem. And I admit the book is sophisticated because it's operating on many levels. Capture elements of this that cannot be captured elsewhere. One thing I'd just say, it's beyond my scope to advise artists what to do, but to me, actually, one lesson of the book is that capitalism is a force of domination against life itself. I'm not alone in making this point, but I think that is actually a concept that we need to capture. It's a concept that goes beyond what Marx, I think, directly. I mean, Marx implicitly implies this, but I think this is where we need to go as kind of left social movements, is conceptualizing this economic system as against life itself. And I would love artists and others to try and express this. Like, what does this actually mean? But again, it's beyond beyond my scope to advise artists. I think artists do a better job of transferring concepts to other media.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And Dinesh, we have a question from Paulomi in the chat for you. She would like you to speak a bit more about your conceptualization of metabolic labor, especially in non-factory settings. And she's talking about the zoo, where animals are, supposed to be close to extinction, are forced to mate and reproduce in these controlled settings.
Right. So that's a great question. The idea of metabolic labor, I draw from a range of different thinkers, and I'd say that they're thinkers that largely have been shaped by a feminist labor tradition. One thinker I draw on particularly is Amrita Panda, who has a book, I think it's called Wombs in Labor, about commercial surrogacy in India. And she talks about the way that the gestational capacity of individuals gets drawn into the production process, and through commercialization turns the body into a means of production so that the baby becomes the product, right? And I would call that metabolic or gestational labor. So it's something, a bodily process that gets captured by a commodity producing process. That story, I think, is applicable to a range of circumstances. So certainly I'd say, and I make the argument that it happens in animal agriculture, where animals are positioned to, in such a way that their metabolic processes to grow themselves get captured as value producing. Notice here, by the way, that I'm using labor in a way that isn't analogical. So what I mean by that is that I'm not saying, look at that donkey, it's pulling a cart in the way that a human might pull a cart, therefore that equals labor. I'm instead saying that labor arises through a production process, and it is the moment that a particular activity is captured by capitalist production process as value producing. We could still apply these examples to different sites. So as you described, the reproductive labor of animals, say in zoos, the capture of that gestational capacity to produce other animals. That we could say that that's labor, though it's potentially slightly different from the way that I'm using the concept, which I'm particularly interested in the formal production of capitalism. That said, that isn't the only place that capitalism produces, right? So it's not just the formal sites of production. And to the extent that zoos themselves are drawn into a worldwide exchange of muddy commodities bodies, potentially this is a useful way to describe what is going on in that forced reproduction that is happening in zoos, either in the name of preservation of species in zoos or in their stated mission to reproduce, say, endangered species to be reintegrate into the wild. So some of that is happening also in zoos. Maybe this metabolic labour is a useful idea to describe that work.
Thanks a
Great
million.
question, by the way.
Thank you.
Right. Rukmini, would you like to go next?
I'm going to try. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can, Rukmini.
Okay, so I think the moment for this question is past, but I did want to ask you, given your very interesting theory between saying that the animal today is both labor and commodity at once, what is the relationship, in your view, between Marxist theory and other theories of commodity fetishism? Because, you know, modern technologies have many ways of fetishizing both dead and live animals and their labor. Do you see a connection? And many questions have been asked about art and various things like that, whether commodity fetishes, how commodity fetishism would fit into your theory of commodities in general in today's capitalist system.
That's a great question, and I wish I could do it justice, but let's try. So for Marx, commodity fetishism represents the socio-cultural attributes that give particular commodities their attractiveness or usefulness within an economy. So I'd say that firstly, this commodity fetishism usefully describes animals as food. So we're in an environment where animals as food have been commodified, have been fetishized as commodities that are seen with this sort of growing use value for human populations. So that's one way to describe that. And the production side, of course, we see animals more and more seen, and this is because of growing production, more and more seen as useful for production and therefore fetishized as raw materials that enter the production process. So they're seen as useful, and that's a socio-cultural production, including a production of the hierarchical anthropocentrism that I described, that positions animals as useful as commodities. One thing I would say, though, and it's one reason why I don't emphasize that reading, is that it is because of the surplus producing capacity of animals that they are actually that their use value arises. So in my view, it is because animals labor that they become useful to capitalism in a particular way. So that's one reason why I emphasize the labor aspect rather than the commodity fetishism aspect, though I'd say that the two things are going hand in hand. I hope I did justice to your question, Rukmini.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. So are you contrasting use value with exchange value in any theorized fashion or theorizable fashion? Or are you saying use value is so important that it kind of reduce that it's you know, the distinction between use and exchange value has become reduced or increased? Which one? I mean, maybe that doesn't. I have to think this through.
No, just quickly to say, in separating use and exchange value, we start to get to the heart of the problem. We get to the problem of why are animals useful for production? If we just stick with exchange value, which is price, we don't get a full picture. Firstly, because we get caught up in the fact that animals aren't paid a wage, and there's a lot of theory in the book that discusses this. But also we get caught up in the apparent profitability of the industry, which misses why animals are useful for production. I make the argument in the book that animals are useful because of the use value of their labor, of their labor power. And that's precisely why humans are useful for capitalism too. And so to me, actually, the distinction is very illustrative. It helps to explain the problem in a better way. That's a short answer. I know we're running out of time.
I get it.
Thanks, Rukmini.
Dinesh, it is 8:30 now, but would you have time to take one last question from Susan?
Absolutely.
Okay, so Susan types in, you talk about an unequal politics and draw heavily on Afro-pessimism, but end the book with dreams. What kind of alternative politics do you envision? Is it a kind of utopian, yet to come politics?
Great question. Yes, of course it's utopian. Of course, I'm dreaming of something that just seems impossible to dream. That we could actually be part of creating a society or societies that reduce exploitation, that produce conditions of freedom and flourishing. But one thing I'd say, and it's something I mentioned, is that at this point, we're aware that the economic system is not doing any favors to anybody. We have rampant, radical, escalating inequality across the world, a growing elite that controls lots of resources and are openly manipulating political power and contorting democratic processes. It's happening globally, and we've seen with that the rise of authoritarianism. We see anthropogenic climate change demonstrating just the incompatibility of our global economic system with the planet, and lots of credible science that says we need to change production and consumption patterns so dramatically that the kind of economic system we're talking about looks nothing like the capitalism we have today. Right? Regardless of where we need, we all know that we need something that is either going to be a capitalism that is fundamentally controlled or monitored or regulated by either by the state or by other processes, or we need a completely different economic system. So in my view, actually, I think this is an important time for us to articulate what we want, right? In my view, what we are talking about are societies built on justice, economies built on justice, which aim to achieve flourishing for more than human beings. So it aims to achieve flourishing for both the human and the non-human. So to me, I don't have the answers about what that looks like, but I do know that we need to be part of those conversations as animal advocates, right? Because the crunch is coming in some respect. It seems a really hopeful dream, given the destruction of global social movements, about neoliberalism. Like, it seems really hard to imagine, but I think we have to be part of. I mean, we went so far as to imagine a world without exploitation of animals. It's not a huge leap to imagine something beyond that, right? Where we also are talking about the economy and the kind of political structures that might achieve a more substantive vision of justice.
Thank you so much for that, Dinesh. The questions could go on forever, but we have already run out of time. Thank you so much for making the time, for your patience, and for your answers this evening. We're really glad you could make it. Thank you, everybody else who came here and participated in this conversation. Have a great evening or a great day, depending on where you are. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.